That night, in a quiet Ohio suburb, 77-year-old Frank Miller sat at the kitchen table across from his only son, David Miller. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound until David leaned forward, his voice sharp but strangely calm. "Dad, I can't stand feeding you anymore." His words cut deeper than any silence ever could. To Frank, it felt less like a complaint and more like a verdict, as if his existence had become an unwanted expense on his son's balance sheet. Frank didn't argue. He didn't plead. Instead, he held David's gaze with a faint smile, not one of mockery, but the quiet, heartbreaking smile of a man who finally understood the truth. His daughter-in-law, Patricia, clattered dishes in the background, pretending not to hear. The grandchildren, Emily and Joshua, were upstairs, unaware of the storm that had just broken in their home. For Frank, the words weren't just cruel. They confirmed something his heart had whispered for months. In his son's house, he was no longer a father, he was a burden. That realization weighed heavier than any brick he had ever lifted in decades of construction work. And in that moment of stillness, Frank made a promise to himself. Tomorrow, everything would change. He would no longer sit silently in the corner of a house where respect had died. Frank barely slept that night. He lay on the narrow bed in the back room of his son's house, staring at the ceiling. The words, "I can't stand feeding you anymore," echoed like a hammer against his chest. For 77 years, he had fought storms, carried bricks, raised walls higher than himself, and never once had he considered himself a burden. Yet, under his son's roof, that's exactly what he had become. He sat in silence, hands resting on his lap, the moonlight slipping through the small window. He could have shouted, demanded respect, reminded David of every sacrifice he and Margaret had made, but he didn't. Sometimes silence holds more weight than 1,000 arguments. And in that silence, Frank made a quiet vow. Tomorrow, he would take back his dignity. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Frank rose from bed. He shaved carefully, using the old razor Margaret had given him decades ago. He buttoned up a flannel shirt, the one she had bought him for their last Christmas together. It wasn't vanity, it was preparation. He wanted to face the day as the man he had always been. Steady, proud, unbroken. He packed a few papers into his worn leather briefcase. Bank documents, an old property deed, letters he had saved over the years. Papers David didn't even know existed. Each sheet was proof that Frank's life had been built on sweat and discipline, not on someone else's charity. He placed the briefcase beside the door and sat for a moment, listening to the house. Patricia clattered in the kitchen. "Not the children," laughed upstairs, their voices pure, untouched by resentment. David's heavy steps moved down the hallway. None of them noticed when Frank slipped out. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of cut grass and damp pavement. Frank walked slowly, his cane tapping against the sidewalk. He nodded at the mailman, at the neighbor sweeping her porch, at the teenager pedaling to school. To them, he looked like any other old man out for an early stroll. But inside, Frank felt a storm settling into resolve. He walked past the diner where he used to take Margaret on Sundays, past the hardware store where he had spent half his paycheck, buying tools, past the little church where he had baptized all 3 of his children. Each place reminded him of who he was and who he refused to stop being. Finally, he reached the county records office. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, greeted him by name. "Mr. Miller, good to see you back." Frank smiled. She didn't know how much strength it took just to stand there. He pulled out the deed to his old house, his real home, the one built with his own hands decades earlier. It was still his. He had never sold it, only rented it to a trusted friend. David and Patricia had no idea. To them, Frank was just an aging man with nowhere else to go. But here was proof. He had options. After the records office, Frank walked to the bank. He confirmed his savings account, modest but steady, built from years of labor. He changed the passwords, updated the signatures, and tucked the documents back into his briefcase. For the first time in months, his shoulders relaxed. He wasn't trapped. He had simply chosen silence too long. That afternoon, Frank boarded a bus headed south. The ride carried him out of the city, through rolling fields and small towns. until he reached the old farmhouse his father had left him in Kentucky. It was weathered, the paint peeling, but the apple trees in the yard still bore fruit, and the front porch still creaked the same way it did when he was a boy. He stepped inside, brushing the dust off a wooden chair. The house smelled of earth and memory. For years it had stood empty, waiting. Tonight it was no longer empty. Tonight it was his refuge. Frank set his briefcase on the table, lit a lamp, and made himself a simple meal: beans, simmered with onions, just like Margaret used to cook. He ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the freedom in every bite. And as he sat alone in the quiet, Frank realized something that would carry him through the days ahead. Sometimes walking away isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only way a man can stand tall again. Frank stood in the middle of the farmhouse kitchen, same one his father had patched together more than half a century ago. The wood floors creaked under his boots and dust floated through the sunbeams slipping in from the window. For a moment it felt as though time had folded back, carrying him to the days when his hands were strong and Margaret's laughter filled the air. He lowered himself into a chair and let his fingers trace the edge of the table. This house wasn't just timber and nails, it was proof of the life he had lived. He remembered the long hours on construction sites, his body bent beneath the weight of bricks, the sting of sweat in his eyes. He had raised walls higher than his head, repaired roofs in storms, and poured concrete until his knees ached. Every paycheck had gone toward raising his family, never toward luxury. Frank thought of his 3 children: Michael, his firstborn, gone too soon in a car accident that nearly broke Margaret's spirit; Anna, his only daughter, who had moved to the West Coast and rarely called anymore, buried in her own busy life; and then David, the youngest, the one who had once promised never to leave his father behind. That promise had dissolved into a sentence so sharp it still rang in Frank's ears. He closed his eyes and saw Margaret's face as it had been in her final years. She was a quiet woman, never one for big speeches, but her strength showed in the way she kept the household running when money was tight, in the way she comforted him when exhaustion threatened to crush his resolve. Frank whispered to himself, "You'd know what to do, Maggie." But Margaret was gone, and the decision was his alone. That evening, after settling into the farmhouse, Frank stepped outside. The orchard stretched wide, the apple trees bent with the weight of fruit. He picked one, wiped it on his sleeve, and took a bite. The taste was tart, sharp, and alive, like something real after months of feeling invisible. It struck him then. He had never been dependent on David. He had chosen to live under his son's roof because he longed for family warmth. But family without respect becomes a prison. And tonight, he was finally free. The next day he drove into town. The streets were familiar: old gas stations, a feed store, a church steeple rising above it all. At the local diner, an elderly couple greeted him with polite nods. "Haven't seen you in a while, Mr. Miller," the waitress said, refilling his coffee with a smile. He realized then that he still belonged somewhere, even if it wasn't where he thought. Back at the farmhouse, Frank pulled out his briefcase and sorted through the papers again. The property deed, the savings account, old letters from Margaret Hall, reminders that his story was far from over. Carefully filed everything into folders, stacking them neatly on the table. These weren't just documents. They were his shield. Proof that he had built a life on his own terms and would continue to protect it. Yet as strong as he felt, the nights brought back shadows. In the quiet, he wrestled with memories of David as a boy running barefoot in the backyard, chasing fireflies, asking endless questions. How had that little boy turned into the man who looked at his father like an unwanted guest? The ache wasn't anger, it was disappointment, heavy and quiet, the kind that seeps into your bones. But even in disappointment, Frank discovered something unexpected: resilience. He found himself waking early, chopping wood, fixing the fence, patching the roof. His body protested, but his spirit felt alive. When with each repair he stitched himself back together. One evening, as the sun sank low over the fields, Frank sat on the porch with a notebook in hand. He began writing small notes at first, just memories and fragments of thoughts. He wrote about Margaret, about the children, about the years he gave to building a life for others. The words flowed like a release. in that farmhouse, far from the judgment of his son Frank, was no longer invisible. He was a man with a voice, and though he didn't yet know what tomorrow would bring, he felt certain of one truth. Dignity isn't given by others. It's reclaimed when you decide you've had enough. The following morning, Frank rose before the sun. The farmhouse was still wrapped in quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't suffocate but steadies a man. He washed his face with cold well water, combed his hair with deliberate care, and buttoned the same flannel shirt Margaret had once ironed for him on Sunday mornings. There was something sacred in those small rituals. It wasn't about vanity. It was about reminding himself that dignity is stitched into the way we carry ourselves. Even when no one is watching, he reached for his leather briefcase, the one worn soft at the edges. Inside were the papers that anchored his resolve. The deed to his old home, the savings account, letters that marked the life he and Margaret had built. He wasn't running from weakness. He was walking toward proof that his worth had never been defined by anyone else's opinion, not even his son's. Stepping onto the porch, Frank breathed in the crisp Kentucky air. His cane tapped lightly against the wooden boards as he descended the steps. Each sound was steady, deliberate, like a drumbeat announcing the beginning of something new. He walked down the dirt road, the weight of decision heavy, but not crushing. He wasn't leaving in bitterness. He was leaving because sometimes the strongest answer a man can give is silence, followed by action. When he reached the small town center, people greeted him with the familiarity of old roots. The grocer waved from his truck. Farmer tipped his cap. Even the teenager working at the gas station offered a respectful "Morning, sir." These gestures were simple, but to Frank, they felt like threads pulling him back into a fabric of belonging. Here, he wasn't invisible. He was seen inside the diner. The smell of bacon and coffee wrapped around him like a memory. He chose a corner booth, set his briefcase beside him, and ordered black coffee with eggs over easy. The waitress, an older woman named Linda who remembered Margaret from years past, leaned in and said softly, "Good to see you back, Mr. Miller. It's been a while." Frank nodded with a half-smile. She didn't know what her words meant to him, but they reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten. Respect can still be found. Even when it feels lost at home. After breakfast, Frank headed to the bank. The manager, a man close to his age, shook his hand warmly. Frank, still sharp as ever. They updated his records, secured his accounts, and by the time Frank walked back outside, he felt lighter, as if chains he hadn't realized he wore had finally fallen away. Later that afternoon, back at the farmhouse, Frank sat on the porch watching the fields sway under the wind. He thought about David, not with anger, but with a calm sadness. He remembered the boy who once held his hand crossing Main Street, who once ran barefoot through the sprinkler in their backyard. Somewhere between that boy and the man who now looked at him as a burden, something had broken. Frank didn't know if it could ever be mended. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't beg for love that came with conditions. That evening, he lit the old wood stove. The crackle of fire filled the room as he cooked a pot of beans with onions, adding just enough chili powder the way Margaret used to. He sat at the table, alone but not lonely, and bowed his head before eating. "Thank you," he whispered, not to anyone in the room, but to life itself. Thank you for giving him the strength to walk away, for the courage to start again, even at 70-7, and as the night deepened, Frank realized something powerful. The world might see silence as weakness, but silence followed by action is strength. His son's words had tried to define him as a burden, but tonight, in the glow of firelight and the taste of his own cooking, Frank knew the truth. He was still a builder, not of houses anymore, but of his own freedom. The farmhouse gave Frank a roof, but it was the papers in his briefcase that gave him peace. Late one evening, he spread them across the kitchen table like a deck of cards each, one carrying the weight of years no one in David's house ever bothered to ask about. There it was, the deed to his old home on Maple Street, the same house where Margaret raised the children and baked pies for every church fundraiser. It was still his, signed in black ink, never sold. David had assumed it was gone, another relic of the past. The truth was simpler. Frank had rented it quietly to an old friend, a retired carpenter who treated it with care.
That still stood.
As proof of his independence, untouched by his son's judgment. Next came the bank papers. Frank flipped through them slowly, the way a man turns the pages of a Bible. The numbers weren't large by today's standards, but they were steady. Years of putting aside a little from every paycheck, lunches skipped, extra shifts taken, nights spent patching roofs instead of resting. It wasn't wealth, but it was security. More importantly, it was his. For the first time in months, he felt a calm smile spread across his face. David's words, "I can't stand feeding you anymore," sounded hollow against the truth. Frank had never lived off his son, not once. He had chosen to move in after Margaret's passing, not because he needed food or shelter, but because he thought family mattered more than pride. He had traded independence for belonging, and in return, he received disdain. That was the real wound. He leaned back in his chair, the lamplight catching the lines of his face, and whispered, "You were wrong about me, son." The next morning, Frank carried the documents to the county attorney. The man, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, listened as Frank explained what he wanted. Everything secured, everything protected. "I don't want to leave a mess when I'm gone," Frank said. The attorney nodded, drafting paperwork to ensure that no one, not even David, could touch what Frank had built without his blessing. As Frank signed each page, he felt something shift inside. For years he had thought of his life in terms of sacrifice, what he gave, what he lost, what he carried. But now, for the first time, he thought of it in terms of preservation. He wasn't just securing property, he was reclaiming the narrative of his own life. On his way back from town, he stopped by the Maple Street house. The porch paint was fading, but the windows gleamed. His old friend Mr. Harris came out, wiping sawdust from his hands. "Frank, didn't expect you." They sat together on the steps, two old men talking about the past, about the years that slipped away faster than they should have. Harris didn't know what had happened with David, and Frank didn't explain. But in that quiet conversation, surrounded by a house built on sweat and memory, Frank felt grounded again. That night back at the farmhouse, Frank made himself a pot of chili. As it simmered, he thought about the irony. His son believed he was carrying the weight of his father, when in truth, Frank had been carrying everyone all along. He had built the walls that sheltered David as a boy, paid the bills that bought his schooling, and stood by him through every misstep. Now, the son saw only a mouth to feed, blind to the hands that once fed him. But here was the hidden truth, one David would never be able to erase. Frank was never powerless. He had resources, a home, savings, and above all, a will stronger than. The years that bent his back might walk slower now, but every step was his own. As he sat by the fire, notebook in hand, Frank wrote a single line. A man is not a burden when he can still stand on his own name. He closed the book and exhaled. The truth wasn't for David. It wasn't for Patricia, or even for Emily. The truth was for himself. Because sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from proving others wrong, but from finally remembering who you always were. Frank's first night back in the old Kentucky farmhouse was quiet. The kind of silence that pressed against the walls and reminded him he was alone. But when morning came, and the sun spilled across the fields, he felt something different. Possibility. He brewed himself a pot of coffee on the old stovetop, the aroma filling the kitchen. It wasn't store-bought fancy grounds, just the same kind he'd been drinking since his 20s. He took his mug to the porch and sat down, watching the apple trees sway in the breeze. The orchard looked wild, branches reaching out in every direction, but the fruit was still good. It reminded him of himself, weathered, scarred, but still standing, still bearing something worthwhile. That morning he started small. He swept the floors, opened the windows, let the breeze push out years of dust. By noon, he had unpacked the photographs of Margaret and the children, placing them carefully on a shelf above the fireplace. Her smile lit up the room even now. Frank whispered, "Well, Maggie, looks like it's just me and you again." The farmhouse needed work, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, Frank felt energized. He repaired a broken step on the porch, patched a hole in the fence, and later that week, cleaned out the chicken coop that had sat empty for years. The rhythm of labor came back naturally, like an old friend. His body ached, yes, but every ache was honest. It wasn't from being ignored, it was from living. One afternoon he drove into the small town nearby, picked up supplies at the feed store, and stopped by the local market. Folks recognized him. "Mr. Miller? Been a long time." The greetings weren't pitying, they were genuine. A handshake here, a clap on the shoulder, they're little reminders that he was still part of a community. Back at the farmhouse, he cooked a simple meal: cornbread, beans, and collard greens. He ate by the light of a single lamp, savoring each bite. It was the kind of meal Margaret would have smiled at, plain but good. That night, lying in his bed with the window cracked open, he heard crickets chirping, an owl calling in the distance. For the first time in a long while, sleep came easy. Days settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with coffee and a walk through the orchard. Afternoons were for chores: clearing brush, fixing gutters, mending what time had broken. Evenings belonged to the quiet hum of the countryside. And in that routine, Frank found something he hadn't felt under David's roof: peace without apology yet. It wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming purpose. When the church down the road needed help repairing a broken bench, Frank showed up with his tools. When a neighbor needed a hand stacking firewood, he pitched in. Slowly, people started to know him not as the old man forgotten by his son, but as Frank Miller, the man who got things done, the man you could count on. One evening, after finishing a long day clearing the orchard, Frank sat on the porch with his notebook. He wrote about the orchard, about the quiet satisfaction of splitting logs, about how the stars looked brighter here than anywhere else. Writing became a ritual, a way to hold on to the clarity he was gaining. Still, sometimes when the night grew too quiet, the past crept back. He thought of David not with anger, but with an ache that wouldn't quite heal. He wondered if his son ever realized what had been lost. But instead of letting those thoughts consume him, Frank leaned into the sound of the wind, the creak of the old farmhouse, the life he was building anew, and little by little, the burden lifted. Not because David changed, but because Frank did. He had walked away from the weight of disrespect and stepped into a life where every choice was his own. As he closed his notebook that night, Frank wrote one simple line that seemed to capture it all: "A man doesn't stop living when he grows old. He stops living when he forgets he can begin again." The farmhouse had become Frank's sanctuary. Weeks slipped into months, and life settled into a rhythm he hadn't known since Margaret was alive. But peace has a way of being tested when you least expect it. It was late one afternoon, the kind where the sun sits heavy on the horizon and paints the fields in gold. Frank was tightening a loose hinge on the back gate when he noticed a figure walking down the long dirt road. The man's shoulders sagged, his shirt clung to him with sweat, and every step looked heavier than the last. Even from a distance, Frank knew who it was. David. Frank froze, his hand gripping the screwdriver. Memories rushed in his son's harsh words, the look of annoyance that had cut deeper than any insult. But this man walking toward him wasn't the same proud, sharp-tongued son he had left behind. This was someone worn down, stripped of all the armor pride once gave him. When David finally reached the gate, he stopped, head bowed, unsure if he even had the right to come closer. For a moment, neither spoke. Frank could have turned away, could have left him standing there. Instead, he raised his hand in a simple gesture. "Come in," his eyes seemed to say, though no words left his mouth. David stepped into the yard. Moving slowly, like a guest in a stranger's home, he sat down on the stone by the porch, his chest rising and falling with the effort of holding himself together. "Dad," he began, his voice cracking, "we've been looking for you." Thought something had happened. Frank didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but because sometimes silence gives more weight to what comes next. David tried again. "Patricia's worried. The kids ask about you. And what I said that night, I didn't mean it. I was tired. I felt trapped. I was wrong." His words tumbled out, awkward, raw. Frank listened, his heart steady but guarded. He wasn't unmoved. He was human. After all but years of giving had taught him something important. Words spoken too late don't erase the wound, they only explain it. And explanations weren't what he needed. Finally, Frank's voice came, low and measured. I didn't leave because of what you said, David. I left because I realized you no longer wanted me there. Respect isn't something a father should have to beg his son for, and affection when it has to be chased. It stops being affection. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. David lowered his head, unable to argue. Tatas, he didn't ask Frank to return. He didn't make promises. He simply placed a hand on his father's shoulder, the first touch in months, and whispered, I just needed to know you were all right. Then he stood, turned back toward the road, and left as quietly as he had arrived. Frank watched him go, the dust rising behind his steps. He didn't feel triumph or bitterness. What he felt was something harder to explain, a release. He hadn't chosen distance out of vengeance. He had chosen it out of survival. That evening, Frank sat on the porch with his notebook. The pages already carried pieces of his story memories, reflections, truths he hadn't spoken aloud. He wrote one more line. Sometimes the bravest act isn't staying to fight for love. Sometimes it's walking away to protect your soul. The next morning, the fields were quiet again. Life returned to its rhythm: coffee on the porch, chores in the yard, small greetings from the neighbors. At deep inside, Frank knew something had shifted. He had faced the past, looked it in the eye, and walked away intact. And though he didn't know if David would ever return again, Frank realized that whether he did or not, it no longer defined him. His worth wasn't tied to his son's recognition. It was rooted in his own two hands, his memories with Margaret, and the dignity he had reclaimed a few weeks past after David's unexpected visit. The days had returned to their gentle rhythm: coffee on the porch, chores in the orchard, evenings with the notebook in his lap. Frank had almost convinced himself that chapter with his son was closed for good. But life has a way of surprising you when you've stopped expecting anything new. It was a Saturday morning when he heard the sound of small footsteps on the gravel road. At first he thought it was one of the neighbor kids, maybe chasing a ball or wandering too far from home. But when he stepped onto the porch, he froze. There, standing at the gate, was a young girl with long brown hair pulled back into a ponytail, clutching a worn backpack against her chest. Are you Mr. Miller? She asked, her voice timid but steady. Frank's heart clenched. Yes, he said cautiously. She shifted nervously, eyes darting toward the farmhouse. I'm Emily, your granddaughter. The name alone almost buckled his knees. He gripped the porch railing for balance. He had seen Emily as a baby, cradled in Patricia's arms, but years had gone by without visits, without birthday calls. And now, here she was, 12 years old, standing in front of him as if she'd stepped out of a memory he thought he'd lost forever. Does your mom know you're here? Frank asked. She shook her head quickly. No, she wouldn't let me. But I wanted to meet you, Dad. Sometimes he talks about you, not always in a nice way, but I wanted to know for myself. Frank swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotions he hadn't let himself feel in years. He pushed the gate open. Come on in, sweetheart. Emily followed him onto the porch, her sneakers scuffing the wooden boards. He poured her a glass of cold water and set it on the table. For a while, they just sat in silence, her small hands wrapped around the glass, his weathered ones folded in his lap. Then Emily smiled faintly. You don't look like what Dad says. Frank raised an eyebrow. And what does he say? That you're stubborn? That you're hard to live with? That you don't know how to let go of the past? She paused, then added softly, but you just look like a grandpa. The words cut straight through him, not with pain, but with a kind of healing he didn't expect. He chuckled, a sound rusty from lack of use. Well, I've been called worse. That first visit lasted only an hour, but when Emily left, she promised to come back, and she did. Every Saturday, she showed up with her school notebooks, eager to read him the short stories she had written. Some were about animals, others about kids her age. But one in particular caught Frank's heart. It was about an old man who lived alone in the woods and discovered he wasn't forgotten after all. Asterisk as she read, Frank would close his eyes and imagine Margaret sitting beside him, listening to. The way Emily's eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams reminded him of the way Margaret used to look when she spoke about the children's future. It was as if a small piece of his wife had returned through the granddaughter they never truly knew. Frank began to look forward to those Saturdays more than anything else. He started saving little chores for Emily, helping him pick apples, feeding the chickens, sweeping the porch. They laughed together, her voice filling the spaces that had grown hollow with time. One afternoon, after she finished reading a story about a bird that couldn't fly but learned to sing, Emily looked at him and said, "You know, Grandpa, you're kind of like that bird." Frank tilted his head. "How so?" "Because maybe you don't try to fly anymore, but you make this place feel like home. You make people want to stay." He couldn't speak for a moment. His eyes burned, and 2 tears slipped free before he could stop them. He reached over and squeezed her hand. That night, as he wrote in his notebook, Frank realized something he hadn't dared to believe. Family can break you, yes, but sometimes from the next generation, family can also heal you. Asterisk, by the time autumn rolled in, the farmhouse no longer looked abandoned. The porch had been painted, the orchard trimmed, and the fence stood straight again. But the biggest change wasn't in the wood or the nails, it was in Frank himself. His steps still carried the weight of his years, but his back no longer bent under shame. Each morning when he laced his boots, he felt purpose humming in his chest. The townspeople began to notice. It started small. Pastor Green asked if Frank could help repair the old church benches. Frank showed up with his toolbox and a steady hand. By sundown, the benches were sturdier than they'd been in decades. "Didn't think anyone still had the patience for work like this," the pastor said, clapping him on the shoulder. Frank just smiled. Word spread. Soon the senior center asked if he could patch their leaky roof. Then a widow down the road called when her fence collapsed after a storm. Frank never charged a dime, didn't need money. What he needed was the simple truth that his hands still had value. Each job, each favor, stitched him back into the fabric of the community. At the diner one afternoon, Linda the waitress poured him his usual cup of coffee and said, "Folks around here are starting to call you the man who keeps this town standing." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. But deep down, the words warmed him. After all, he'd been called lately burden, trouble. Nuisance. This title felt like an honor he hadn't expected. Even Emily noticed the difference. Every Saturday, when she arrived with her notebook, she would listen as neighbors stopped by the porch to ask for Frank's advice on fixing a door or mending a broken tool. She'd beam with pride, telling him, "Grandpa, you're famous." Frank would laugh. Though a part of him knew she was right in her own way, the respect from the town didn't erase the hurt David had caused. But it did something more important, to replace despair with belonging. People saw him not for what he had lost, but for what he still had to give. That kind of recognition wasn't about applause or titles. It was about being needed, being trusted, being part of something bigger than himself. One evening, after finishing a day's work at the church, Frank was invited to stay for supper in the fellowship hall. Dozens of townsfolk gathered around long tables covered with casseroles, pies, and steaming plates of cornbread. When Frank entered, the conversations quieted, then picked back up with warmth. "Come sit with us, Mr. Miller. Glad you came tonight." He was no longer a shadow at the edge of someone else's family. Here he belonged. As the evening wound down, Pastor Green stood to speak. "There's a reason we invited Frank tonight," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "This man has reminded us all of something important, that dignity doesn't fade with age. It grows, if you let it. Frank, thank you for showing us what it means to live with purpose." The room erupted in gentle applause. It's not loud, not showy, but heartfelt. Frank sat there stunned. His fork paused over a slice of apple pie. He didn't stand up to make a speech. He didn't need to. He just nodded, eyes shining, and whispered to himself, "Maggie would have liked this." That night, walking home under the stars, Frank felt lighter than he had in years. For so long, he had carried the weight of rejection from his own blood. But here, among people who weren't bound to him by family ties, he had found something almost more precious, respect freely given. Back at the farmhouse, as Emily sat waiting on the porch, her notebook in her lap. "How was dinner, Grandpa?" she asked. Frank smiled, lowering himself into the chair beside her. "It was good, sweetheart. It's real good. Sometimes it's not the house you live in that makes you feel at home. It's the people who see you for who you are." And with that, he realized he was no longer just surviving. He was living again. Winter came quietly to Kentucky. Frost clung to the edges of the orchard, and smoke curled from the farmhouse chimney each evening. Frank had grown used to the rhythm of his day's morning coffee, a few chores, and often a visit from Emily with her notebook of stories. Life wasn't perfect, but it was steady. And steadiness, at his age, felt like a blessing. One Sunday afternoon, the town council invited him to the square for a small ceremony. He thought it would be no more than a handshake and a thank you. Maybe for the repairs he'd done at the church, or the work at the senior center. But when he arrived, he was surprised to see a crowd gathered: neighbors, shopkeepers, the pastor, even children from the local school. A banner stretched across the courthouse steps, honoring Mr. Frank Miller for service, strength, and spirit. Frank felt his knees weaken. He wasn't a man used to recognition. Most of his life had been spent behind the scenes, building homes for others, raising a family, keeping promises quietly. Now, standing in the cold air with all eyes on him, he felt something stir deep inside his sense that his story mattered after all. The mayor handed him a plaque, but it was the words spoken next that struck him hardest. Mr. Miller reminds us that dignity doesn't end with age, shows us that even when life tests us, even when family falters, a man can still stand tall. Thank you, Frank, for teaching us not just how to live, but how to endure. Applause filled the square. Frank's hands trembled as he held the plaque, but his heart was steady. He didn't give a long speech, simply leaned toward the microphone and said, "I'm not a special man. I'm just a man who decided not to disappear." As the ceremony ended, Frank's eyes caught movement in the crowd. Toward the back, near the church steps, stood David. His posture was stiff, his face drawn. But his eyes, red and unguarded, were locked on his father. Beside him stood Emily, holding a sign painted in careful letters. "Thank you, Grandpa, for not giving up on yourself." For a moment, the world went silent. Frank didn't move toward them, and they didn't push forward. But something shifted. In that space of recognition, not of forgiveness or reconciliation, but of truth. The boy who had once dismissed him as a burden was gone. In his place stood a man humbled by loss, finally able to see what had been in front of him all along. That evening, back at the farmhouse, Frank lit a fire and sat with his notebook. He didn't write about the plaque or the applause. He wrote about the look in David's eyes, about the courage it took for Emily to hold that sign, about how sometimes closure doesn't arrive as a grand reunion, but as a quiet acknowledgement. He scribbled the words slowly. Respect that comes too late doesn't heal, but it no longer wounds. And in that space, peace can grow. Closing the notebook, Frank leaned back in his chair. He thought of Margaret, of the life they had built, of the son who had lost his way, and the granddaughter who had found her way back to him. For the first time in many years, he felt whole, not because everything had been fixed, but because he no longer carried the weight of bitterness. He knew there would still be lonely nights, still be moments when regret pressed close. But he also knew he didn't need to beg for love, nor did he need to shut his heart completely. He had carved out something rarer, something stronger, a life with dignity, a future shaped not by rejection, but by choice. As the fire burned low, Frank whispered softly into the room, "At last, I'm myself again." And with that, he realized the story of his life was not one of loss, but of quiet triumph. Life has a way of testing us in the places that hurt the most. For Frank, it wasn't the years of hard labor or the long nights of loneliness that broke him. It was hearing his own son call him a burden. Yet from that wound came something powerful. He discovered that dignity doesn't depend on how others see us. It comes from remembering who we are, what we've built, and the quiet strength that still lives inside us, no matter our age. Many of us reach a point where we wonder if we still matter when family grows distant, when friends pass on, when the world moves too fast. But Frank's story reminds us that respect is not something to beg for. It is something we protect day by day, in the way we choose to live. Sometimes the bravest act isn't holding on, it's walking away from where love has died, and building peace where it can bloom again. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Has life ever taught you a similar lesson about dignity or starting over? Leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. And if you want to hear more stories that speak to the soul, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these voices alive.